July 18, 1944, 3:47 p.m., Guam, Mariana Islands. Sergeant Yoshio Tanaka watched through the vision slit of his Type 95 Hago light tank as American Marines advanced across the open ground near Fonte Plateau. Behind him, concealed in jungle vegetation, sat 4 more Japanese tanks, the armored spearhead meant to drive the Americans back into the sea. The Americans have no real anti-tank weapons, his company commander had briefed that morning. Their infantry carries pipe-like devices, crude rocket launchers that are inaccurate and ineffective. Our tanks are invulnerable to infantry attack. We will crush them. Through his periscope, Tanaka saw an American Marine kneeling 150 meters away, shouldering what looked like a metal tube. The bazooka the briefing had dismissed. Tanaka smiled. At 150 meters, with a rocket that flew slowly enough to watch, the American would need impossible luck to hit a moving tank. The Marine fired. Tanaka watched the rocket trace toward his tank, moving slower than he'd expected, almost lazy in its trajectory. He had time to think. He missed high before the rocket struck his turret. What happened next took 1.3 seconds and redefined Japanese understanding of American infantry anti-tank capability. The M6A3 shaped charge warhead, containing 1.5 pounds of pentolite explosive, detonated on impact. The explosion didn't penetrate through force, it focused through physics. The shaped charge created a jet of superplastic metal traveling at 25,000 feet per second. That jet burned through the Hago's 12mm turret armor like a cutting torch through rice paper. Inside the tank, the jet fragmented, sending white-hot metal particles ricocheting through the crew compartment. The tank's ammunition ignited. Secondary explosions blew the turret completely off the hull. Sergeant Tanaka and his crew died before they could scream. The entire engagement, from rocket launch to catastrophic kill, lasted less than 5 seconds. The remaining 4 Japanese tanks watched their lead vehicle transform into a fireball. Their crews, who moments before had been confident in their armor's protection, suddenly understood they were facing a weapon that made armor irrelevant. Within 20 minutes, all 5 Japanese tanks would be burning wrecks. Within 2 weeks, Japanese armored doctrine on Guam would collapse completely. Within 2 months, Japanese tankers throughout the Pacific would be writing final letters home before operations, knowing that American infantry could kill them from distances they couldn't fight back. This is the story of how American infantry portable anti-tank weapons revolutionized Pacific Island warfare, how shaped charge technology defeated Japanese armored tactics, and how Japanese soldiers scoffing turned to terror as their tanks, their mobile fortresses, became death traps that burst into flames from weapons they dismissed as toys. To understand why Japanese soldiers initially scoffed at the bazooka, you need to understand Japanese tank doctrine and the reality of early Pacific warfare, where Japanese armor had dominated American infantry with near impunity. Japanese tank design reflected different priorities than European armor. Japan wasn't preparing for tank versus tank warfare across open plains. They were preparing for infantry support in jungles, mountains, and island fortifications, where tanks would fight against infantry, not other tanks. The Type 95 Hago light tank embodied this philosophy perfectly. Type 95 Hago specifications: weight 7.4 tons, armor 6 to 12 millimeters, thin by European standards, main gun 37mm Type 94. Secondary armament, 2 7.7mm machine guns. Crew, 3. Speed, 28 miles per hour road, 12 miles per hour cross-country. Engine, 120 horsepower diesel. By European standards, the Hago was pathetically armored and undergunned. A German Panzer IV or American Sherman would destroy it effortlessly. But in the Pacific theater of 1941 to 1943, the Hago faced enemies without effective anti-tank weapons. Against infantry armed with rifles and machine guns, 12 millimeters of armor was impenetrable. The heavier Type 97 Chiha medium tank was more formidable. Type 97 Chiha specifications: weight 15 tons, armor 8 to 25 millimeters, main gun 57mm Type 97, secondary armament 2 7.7mm machine guns. Crew, 4. Speed 24 miles per hour road, 15 miles per hour cross-country, again weak by European standards, but devastating against infantry without anti-tank weapons. Japanese tank tactics in early Pacific fighting had been brutally effective. At Singapore in February 1942, Japanese tanks had smashed through British positions. At the Philippines in 1942, they'd overrun American defensive lines. On Guadalcanal in 1942, they'd terrorize Marines who had no effective weapons to stop them. Captain Jiro Ikeda, commanding a tank company on Guadalcanal, described the psychological advantage in his diary. "American infantry fear our tanks greatly. They have no weapons capable of penetrating our armor. When we advance, they flee or die. Individual Marines show great courage. But courage without weapons is useless. They throw grenades that bounce off our armor. They fire rifles that cannot penetrate. They die heroically but ineffectively." The Americans had tried various improvised anti-tank methods. Marines would climb onto tanks, trying to pry open hatches or pour gasoline through vision slits. They'd use satchel charges, explosives on poles pushed against tank hulls. They'd concentrate rifle fire, hoping to damage optics or jam weapons. All methods required getting within arm's reach of the tank, close enough that machine, gunfire, and infantry support usually killed the attacker before he could disable the tank. Japanese tankers on Guadalcanal reported killing dozens of Marines who'd attempted such desperate close-range attacks. Private First Class Robert Leckie, a Marine who fought on Guadalcanal, described the helplessness in his memoir. "Japanese tanks weren't much by Europe's standards, but to us they were invincible. We had no weapons that could stop them at range. Boys died throwing themselves at those tanks with grenades and charges, trying to get close enough to damage them. It was medieval warfare. We were using our bodies as weapons because we had nothing else." The strategic impact was significant. Japanese commanders used tanks to anchor defensive positions, knowing American infantry would take heavy casualties trying to reduce fortified positions supported by armor. They used tanks in counterattacks, knowing American infantry would break rather than stand against armor they couldn't defeat. By mid-1943, the U.S. military had identified infantry anti-tank capability as a critical need. American soldiers needed a weapon that could kill Japanese tanks at range, operated by standard infantry, without requiring heroic suicide attacks. The solution arrived in the form of a weapon Japanese intelligence would fatally underestimate: the M1A1 2.36-inch rocket launcher, universally known by the nickname that would become legendary, the Bazooka. The Bazooka wasn't sophisticated by artillery standards. It was crude, simple, and relied on physics rather than brute force to defeat armor. That simplicity was its genius. M1A1 Bazooka specifications: length 54 inches, weight 13.3 pounds, empty, caliber 2.36 inches, 60 millimeters, maximum effective range 300 yards, practical combat range 100 to 150 yards, rocket weight 3.4 pounds, warhead M6, a 3-shaped charge 1.5 pounds pentalite, penetration 3 to 4 inches of armor, crew 2, gunner and loader, rate of fire 4 to 5 rounds per minute, cost per launcher $18, training time 2 hours for basic proficiency. The weapon was revolutionary not because it was powerful, it wasn't by artillery standards, but because it gave ordinary infantry soldiers the ability to kill tanks. The key was the shaped charge warhead. Unlike conventional explosives that penetrated through kinetic energy, moving fast and hitting hard, shaped charges used the Munroe Effect, discovered in 1888 but not weaponized effectively until World War II. The physics were elegant. A hollow cone of explosive lined with copper. When detonated, the explosion focused into the hollow, turning the copper liner into a jet of superplastic metal traveling at hypersonic speeds. This jet didn't blow through armor, it burned through, creating a focused penetrator that could defeat armor several times thicker than the warhead itself. The M6A3 warhead could penetrate 3 to 4 inches of armor plate. The thickest armor on any Japanese tank was 25 millimeters, roughly 1 inch. The bazooka had more than triple the penetration needed to kill any Japanese armored vehicle. But the weapon had limitations Japanese intelligence correctly identified. Accuracy. The rocket was unguided, fin-stabilized, and slow. Wind affected trajectory significantly. Moving targets were difficult to hit beyond 100 yards. Range, effective combat range was 100 to 150 yards, well within Japanese tank machine gun range. Crews attempting to fire bazookas could be suppressed or killed before shooting. Reliability. Early models had electrical firing systems that failed in humid tropical conditions. Batteries died. Connections corroded. Misfires were common. Backblast. The rocket motor produced a massive backblast that revealed the shooter's position and could injure personnel behind the weapon. Bazookas couldn't be fired from enclosed positions. Japanese intelligence assessments from early 1944, based on captured weapons and interrogation of prisoners, concluded the American II 36-inch rocket launcher is an infantry anti-tank weapon of limited effectiveness. It is inaccurate beyond 100 meters, unreliable in tropical conditions, and requires exposure to enemy fire to employ. While the shaped charge warhead can theoretically penetrate our tank armor, the practical difficulties of employing the weapon under combat conditions make it a minimal threat. Japanese tanks remain superior to American infantry anti-tank capabilities. This assessment was technically accurate. Every limitation Japanese intelligence identified was real. But the assessment fatally underestimated three factors. First, American training. Marines and soldiers were being trained extensively on bazooka employment. Not as tank destroyers in the European sense, but as infantry support weapons integrated into squad tactics. Second, American doctrine. The US military wasn't trying to engage Japanese tanks in fair fights at long range. They were developing tactics to get bazookas into close range where accuracy problems disappeared. Third, the psychological impact. Japanese tankers had spent years operating with near-impunity to infantry attack. The bazooka would shatter that confidence, turning tanks from mobile fortresses into death traps. The test of these factors would come in summer 1944, when American forces invaded the Mariana Islands and Japanese tanks encountered bazookas in large-scale combat for the first time. June 15, 1944, Saipan, Mariana Islands. The Japanese launched their largest armored counterattack of the Pacific War. 44 tanks, mostly Type 97 Chihas, supported by infantry, attempting to drive the American invasion force back into the sea. The attack began at 3 a.m. with tanks advancing in darkness, confident that American infantry couldn't stop them. Japanese doctrine assumed night attacks would prevent effective use of American anti-tank weapons. They were catastrophically wrong. American Marines had been issued the improved M1A1 Bazooka with waterproofed electronics, better rockets, and extensive training in night firing techniques. More importantly, Marine doctrine had integrated bazookas into every infantry platoon with specific anti-tank teams trained to engage armor. Corporal Robert Reed, commanding a bazooka team in the 2nd Marine Division, was positioned in a shell crater when Japanese tanks emerged from the darkness. His account, recorded days later, described what happened. "We heard them before we saw them, engine noise, track clanking, then silhouettes against the sky. My loader, PFC Martinez, had a round loaded. Range maybe 80 yards. I aimed center mass on the lead tank and fired. The backblast lit up our position like a flare. I knew we'd have to move immediately. But first, I watched the round hit. The M6A3 rocket struck the Type 97 just below the turret ring. The shape-charged jet penetrated the 25mm hull armor and ignited ammunition stored in the hull. The tank exploded from internal pressure. The turret blown 15 feet into the air. The crew died instantly. Second tank was turning toward us," Reed continued. "Martinez had another round loaded. We'd practiced this hundreds of times. I fired again. Hit the turret front, penetration, fire, explosion, 2 tanks dead in maybe 30 seconds. Then we ran like hell because their infantry was shooting at our backblast position." This scene repeated itself across the Saipan beachhead. Japanese tanks, attacking in darkness and expecting to overwhelm American infantry through shock and firepower, ran into bazooka teams that could see them silhouetted against the sky and could kill them from positions the tanks couldn't suppress quickly enough. Of 44 Japanese tanks committed to the counterattack, 31 were destroyed by dawn. Bazooka teams accounted for at least 24 confirmed kills. The remaining 13 tanks withdrew in disorder, their commanders shocked by losses that shouldn't have been possible. Captain Sake Oba, a Japanese infantry officer who witnessed the attack, wrote in his diary, "Our tank company was destroyed in hours. The Americans have weapons we did not expect. Rockets fired from man-portable launchers, striking tanks and destroying them with single hits. Our tankers died in their vehicles, unable to respond effectively to infantry they could not see, firing weapons they could not avoid. This changes everything. Our tanks are no longer invulnerable. Japanese intelligence immediately revised their assessments. The bazooka wasn't a minor threat. It was a critical threat that made daylight tank operations suicidal, and night operations only marginally less deadly. But institutional momentum is hard to stop. Japanese doctrine still emphasized aggressive armored counterattacks. Tank crews still believed in the psychological advantage of armor. And on Guam, in July 1944, they would learn the lesson again, harder. July 18, 1944, Fonte Plateau, Guam. The 9th Tank Regiment, Japanese 29th Division, prepared for a counterattack meant to throw American Marines off the island. The regiment fielded 38 tanks, a mix of Type 95 Hagos and Type 97 Chihas. Japanese planners believed this concentration of armor would be decisive. American Marines defending Fonte Plateau had other ideas. The 3rd Marine Division had integrated lessons from Saipan. Every rifle company had bazooka teams. Every platoon had practiced anti-tank ambush tactics. And critically, Marines had learned to use terrain to negate Japanese armor advantages. The Japanese attack began at 3:47 p.m., with tanks advancing across open ground. Exactly the type of approach that had worked on Guadalcanal in 1942, but was suicide against bazooka-equipped infantry in 1944. Private First Class Tony Stein, a Marine bazooka gunner, was positioned behind a low coral ridge when Japanese tanks appeared 200 yards away. His after-action account described the engagement. 5 tanks in line formation, advancing slow. We'd been told to wait until they were close, 100 yards or less for sure hits. I waited. At 150 yards, I couldn't stand it anymore and fired. Hit the lead tank in the turret, it brewed up. Ammunition explosion, turret blown off. The other 4 tanks stopped, trying to identify where the shot came from. That gave 3 other bazooka teams time to set up and fire. In maybe 2 minutes, all 5 tanks were burning. The massacre continued for 40 minutes, Japanese tanks attempting to advance across terrain that offered no cover against infantry armed with bazookas were destroyed methodically. Tank commanders who tried to retreat were hit from behind. The Hago's rear armor was only 6 millimeters, even more vulnerable than the frontal 12 millimeters. Some Japanese tank crews tried desperate tactics. They attempted to button up completely, relying on periscopes for vision. But this made them blind to bazooka teams maneuvering for flank shots. They attempted to suppress suspected bazooka positions with machine gun fire, but bazookas could be fired from positions 100 yards away that machine guns couldn't effectively engage. Sergeant Yoshio Tanaka's tank, the first killed in the engagement, was followed by 24 more in rapid succession. By nightfall, the 9th Tank Regiment had ceased to exist as a combat unit. Of 38 tanks committed, 32 were destroyed. 24 of those were confirmed bazooka kills. The remaining 6 tanks withdrew with their crews psychologically broken. Lieutenant Tadashi Suzuki, one of the few tank commanders to survive, was captured 2 weeks later. His interrogation revealed the psychological impact. "We were trained that our tanks made us superior to infantry. That armor protected us. That Americans feared our tanks. At Fonte, we learned this was wrong. American infantry didn't fear our tanks, they killed them. From distances we couldn't fight back effectively. With weapons that penetrated our armor as if it didn't exist. I watched 12 tanks from my company burn in 30 minutes. 12 crews, friends, comrades died in flames. After that, I didn't want to command a tank. I wanted to survive." By August 1944, both American and Japanese forces had learned critical lessons about bazooka warfare. The Americans learned how to employ the weapon more effectively. The Japanese learned how to fear it appropriately. American Marine and Army doctrine evolved rapidly. Bazooka teams operated in pairs. One team would fire to reveal position, then immediately displace. The second team, positioned nearby, would fire on any tank that turned to engage the first team's position. Japanese tanks attempting to suppress bazooka teams often expose flanks or rear armor to other teams. Integration with terrain. Bazookas were positioned on high ground when possible, firing down onto thin-top armor. They were positioned behind cover that allowed teams to fire and immediately move to alternate positions. Coordination with other weapons. Machine guns and rifles would suppress Japanese infantry supporting tanks, while bazookas focused exclusively on armor. This prevented Japanese infantry from spotting and killing bazooka teams. Night tactics. Marines learned to use flares and tracer fire to silhouette Japanese tanks against bright backgrounds, making them visible to bazooka teams while the teams remained concealed in darkness. Sergeant Robert Reed, whose bazooka team had killed 2 tanks on Saipan, refined his tactics on Guam and later Iwo Jima. His unit's tactics manual, written after the war, captured the doctrine: the bazooka kills tanks through psychology as much as physics. Japanese tankers know we can kill them. They know they can't see us until we fire. They know that after we fire once, they have seconds to locate and suppress us before we fire again from a different position. This knowledge makes them hesitant, defensive, afraid. A tank commanded by a frightened crew is already half defeated. The bazooka doesn't just penetrate armor, it penetrates confidence. Japanese doctrine struggled to adapt. Their tanks couldn't be up-armored significantly. Japanese industrial capacity was limited, and thicker armor would reduce mobility. Their tank guns couldn't effectively engage infantry in covered positions. Their infantry support was often insufficient to screen tanks from bazooka teams. Some Japanese units attempted to develop countermeasures: standoff wire cages, welded around tanks to detonate shaped charges before they reached armor. These worked in theory but added weight, reduced visibility, and could be defeated by firing at areas without cage protection. Aggressive infantry screening, tank attacks supported by large infantry forces meant to locate and kill bazooka teams. This worked when the Japanese had numerical superiority but required troops they increasingly didn't have. Avoiding armor employment. Some Japanese commanders simply stopped using tanks in combat, preserving them as static pillboxes rather than risking them in mobile operations. This negated the purpose of having tanks. None of these countermeasures proved effective enough to restore Japanese confidence in armored operations. February-March 1945, Iwo Jima. The Japanese deployed 23 tanks on Iwo Jima, their last significant armored force in the Pacific. Rather than using them in mobile counterattacks, Japanese commanders mostly buried them as static pillboxes, using only their guns while protecting the hull with earth and concrete. This defensive use reflected Japanese understanding that tanks operating in the open against bazooka-equipped Marines were dead tanks. But even as buried fortifications, the tanks remained vulnerable. Marines would use bazookas to engage tank gun positions at ranges where the tanks couldn't effectively return fire. The shaped charge warheads could penetrate the concrete and earth covering the tanks, or could be fired through vision ports and hatches. What should have been formidable fortifications became steel coffins. Private First Class Douglas Jacobson was awarded the Medal of Honor for actions on Iwo Jima that included destroying 16 Japanese fighting positions in a single day, 7 of them using a bazooka, including 2 buried tanks. His citation noted, "Armed with a bazooka, he advanced alone against fortified enemy positions, destroying machine gun nests, blockhouses, and 2 buried tanks." His aggressive use of the bazooka as a direct-fire assault weapon demonstrated evolution of American infantry anti-tank tactics beyond original doctrinal concepts. Jacobson's actions illustrated how the bazooka had evolved beyond a pure anti-tank weapon into a general-purpose infantry support tool for destroying fortifications, a role Japanese defenders hadn't anticipated when they buried their tanks for protection. Of 23 Japanese tanks on Iwo Jima, 21 were destroyed during the battle. At least 14 were confirmed bazooka kills. The remaining 2 were disabled and abandoned. Not a single Japanese tank achieved a significant tactical success against American forces. The pattern repeated on Okinawa in April to June 1945. Japanese tanks, whether employed mobile or static, were systematically destroyed by bazooka-equipped infantry who had refined tactics through years of Pacific Island combat. Behind the tactical statistics were human beings who died in flames inside tanks that had become death traps. Sergeant Yoshio Tanaka, 24 years old, died in the first seconds of the Guam tank battle when his Type 95 was hit by a bazooka. The shaped charge jet killed him instantly, a mercy compared to what happened to many of his comrades, who survived the initial penetration only to burn as ammunition cooked off. Corporal Kenji Watanabe, 22 years old, commanded a Type 97 on Saipan. His tank was hit by a bazooka round that penetrated the turret ring but didn't immediately kill the crew. The tank caught fire. Watanabe got his driver and gunner out through the hatches before flames engulfed the interior. He died attempting to help his loader escape. The loader's body was found half out of the turret hatch, where they'd both been trapped by flames. Lieutenant Hiroshi Nakamura, 26 years old, commanded the 3rd Tank Platoon on Iwo Jima. His tank was buried as a pillbox, which he believed would protect him. A bazooka round penetrated the vision slit, killing him and wounding 2 crew members. The survivors evacuated the tank, which was then destroyed by demolition charges. Nakamura died in what he thought was a safe position. The Japanese army lost approximately 2,500 tankers killed in the Pacific Theater. Many died in conventional combat, but hundreds died specifically to bazookas, trapped in burning tanks, killed by jets of superplastic metal penetrating armor they'd trusted to protect them. American casualties from anti-tank operations were proportionally lower, but still significant. Bazooka teams were priority targets for Japanese infantry. The backblast signature made them easy to spot, and the close ranges required for effective fire meant they operated within enemy small arms range. Private First Class Joseph Martinez, a bazooka loader on Saipan, was killed by Japanese machine gun fire 3 seconds after his team fired their second rocket at a tank. The round hit and destroyed the tank, but Martinez died before seeing the result. He was 19 years old. Corporal Anthony DeLuca, a bazooka gunner on Guam, was killed when his position was overrun by Japanese infantry after he'd destroyed 2 tanks. His loader, Private James Wilson, survived and reported that DeLuca had refused to retreat despite being wounded, continuing to engage tanks until Japanese infantry killed him at close range. DeLuca was 21 years old. The bazooka's effectiveness came with a price. The teams using them had to get close to tanks that were trying to kill them, fire from positions that revealed themselves, and often couldn't escape before Japanese infantry or artillery targeted them. The M1A1 Bazooka of 1943 evolved significantly based on Pacific combat experience. By 1945, American forces were using the M9A1, improved in nearly every way. Improved rocket with better accuracy, better sights for ranging, collapsible design for easier transport, protective features to prevent electrical shorts from jungle moisture. But the most significant evolution wasn't hardware, it was doctrine. The bazooka had been developed as an anti-tank weapon, but combat experience showed it was effective against pillboxes, bunkers, buildings, and any hard target that needed precision demolition. This versatility made bazookas essential infantry equipment. By 1945, Marine rifle companies in the Pacific Theater were requesting more bazookas, not because they expected more Japanese tanks, but because bazookas were effective general-purpose assault weapons. The Japanese never developed an effective counterpart. They fielded the Type 4 70mm rocket launcher in 1944, similar in concept to the bazooka but plagued by reliability issues, poor accuracy, and limited production. Few Japanese infantry units ever received them. This asymmetry, American infantry with abundant, reliable anti-tank weapons versus Japanese forces without, contributed to American tactical superiority in the final year of the Pacific War. By early 1945, Japanese military assessments had completely revised their evaluation of the bazooka. Intelligence reports captured after the war revealed the shift. The American 2.36-inch rocket launcher represents a significant technological advantage in infantry anti-tank warfare. Our initial assessments underestimated its effectiveness due to focus on technical limitations rather than tactical employment. American doctrine integrates the weapon effectively with infantry tactics, terrain use, and combined arms coordination. Japanese armored forces have no effective counter to this weapon system. Recommendation: avoid employment of armor in offensive operations against American infantry. Use tanks only as buried defensive positions where terrain and fortification may provide some protection. This was a complete reversal of 1943 assessments that had dismissed the bazooka as ineffective. But by the time the Japanese military understood the threat, they had already lost most of their tanks and trained tank crews. Captain Jiro Ikeda, who had written confidently about Japanese tank superiority on Guadalcanal in 1942, was killed commanding a tank on Okinawa in 1945. His final letter home, written the night before the battle where he died, showed the evolution of Japanese tanker psychology. Tomorrow we attack American positions I do not expect to survive. The Americans have weapons that destroy tanks easily. Rockets fired from shoulder-mounted launchers that penetrate any armor we possess. My tank is not a weapon anymore. It is my coffin. I drive it into battle knowing I will die inside it. But this is my duty. Please remember me as a soldier who did his duty even when he knew it meant death. Akita's tank was hit by a bazooka within 5 minutes of leaving its concealed position. He and his crew were killed instantly. His body was recovered by American forces, and his letter eventually reached his family through Red Cross channels after the war. The psychological impact on Japanese tankers was severe. Men who had volunteered for armored forces believing tanks provided protection and tactical advantage were reassigned to units they knew were death sentences. Some requested transfer to infantry. Some developed what Japanese medical officers called tank fever, anxiety symptoms appearing before armored operations. Japanese tanker morale collapsed in 1944 to 1945, not because they were cowards, but because they accurately assessed their chances of survival. Operating a tank against bazooka-equipped American infantry was statistically fatal. After the war, both American and Japanese military analysts studied the bazooka's impact on Pacific fighting. The conclusions reshaped infantry anti-tank doctrine worldwide. American analysis concluded, the M1/M9 bazooka was decisively effective against Japanese armor. The shape-charge warhead provided penetration far exceeding requirements against Japanese tank armor thickness. The weapon's portability allowed integration at infantry squad level. Limitations in range and accuracy were offset by tactical employment emphasizing close-range ambush tactics. The bazooka's psychological impact on Japanese tankers was as significant as its technical capability. Japanese armor effectiveness declined sharply after mid-1944, partially due to crew reluctance to operate vehicles they knew to be vulnerable. Japanese analysis was brutally honest. Japanese armored forces were rendered obsolete by American infantry anti-tank weapons, primarily the 2.36-inch rocket launcher. Our tanks possessed insufficient armor to defeat shaped charge warheads. Our doctrine did not adapt quickly enough to the changed threat environment. Our industrial capacity could not produce comparable weapons or upgrade existing tanks. Result: Japanese armor became ineffective 1944 to 1945, contributing to loss of tactical mobility and defensive effectiveness. The broader lesson extended beyond the Pacific. The bazooka proved that shaped charge technology could allow infantry to defeat armor without requiring heavy anti-tank guns. This principle would evolve into modern infantry anti-tank guided missiles that make contemporary tanks vulnerable to foot soldiers, the same dynamic that shocked Japanese tankers in 1944. June 1985, Marine Corps Base Camp, Pendleton, California. On the 40th anniversary of the end of the Pacific War, the Marine Corps hosted a symposium on infantry weapons development. Among the attendees were American veterans who had used bazookas in combat and Japanese veterans who had faced them. Former Corporal Robert Reed, who had killed 2 tanks with his bazooka on Saipan, now 64 years old, stood before a displayed M1A1 Bazooka. This weapon saved my life and the lives of countless Marines. Before we had bazookas, stopping Japanese tanks required getting close enough to touch them. Suicide missions where most men died trying. After we got bazookas, we could kill tanks from 100 yards away. Still dangerous, still required courage, but not automatic suicide. This weapon changed the mathematics of Pacific Island fighting. Former Lieutenant Tadashi Suzuki, who had commanded a tank on Guam and survived its destruction, spoke through a translator. I commanded a Type 97 tank. I believe the armor protected me. Then I watched 12 tanks from my regiment destroyed in 30 minutes by weapons I'd been taught were ineffective. I learned that our intelligence was wrong, our doctrine was wrong, and our confidence was misplaced. The bazooka didn't just destroy our tanks, it destroyed our belief that armor provided protection. The discussion turned to technical assessments. Former Marine weapons officers explained bazooka employment doctrine. Former Japanese tankers described the terror of operating vehicles they knew were vulnerable. Former Sergeant Kenji Yamamoto, who had survived 2 tank destructions on Saipan, added, "The first time my tank was hit, I didn't understand what happened. 1 second we were advancing, the next there was an explosion and my gunner was dead. We evacuated and I thought we were unlucky. Hit by artillery, maybe. The second time I understood. I saw the rocket approaching, I had time to think bazooka before it hit. I was the only survivor of that crew. After that I requested transfer to infantry. I told my commander I would rather face bullets than ride in a tank that American infantry could destroy with handheld weapons. An American weapons engineer presented technical analysis of the shaped charge penetration mechanism. A Japanese engineer who had worked on tank armor design listened and finally spoke. We understood shaped charge physics. We knew theoretically that such weapons could defeat our armor. But we believed the practical difficulties, accuracy, range, reliability, would make them marginally effective. We were wrong. American training and doctrine overcame the technical limitations. You practiced until accuracy was acceptable. You developed tactics to get within effective range. You made the weapons reliable through better design. We failed to adapt because we believed our own assessments over battlefield evidence. The symposium concluded with mutual recognition that the bazooka had fundamentally changed infantry armor dynamics. Former enemies who had fought with and against the weapon stood together, acknowledging its impact. Former Lieutenant Suzuki offered final words. Japanese soldiers initially scoffed at the bazooka because we didn't understand it. We saw a crude tube that fired slow rockets inaccurately. We missed that it didn't need sophistication, it needed effectiveness. American soldiers didn't care if the bazooka looked primitive, they cared that it killed our tanks. It did. We learned to fear it. That fear was deserved. The weapon that we scoffed at destroyed Japanese armored capability in the Pacific. The M1/M9 Bazooka remained in U.S. service through the Korean War, where it proved effective against North Korean T-34 tanks. Surprising given the T-34's much heavier armor. The shaped charge principle the bazooka pioneered evolved into modern anti-tank weapons, the M72 LAW, the AT-4, the Javelin missile system. Every modern army equips infantry with portable anti-tank weapons descended from the bazooka. The principle that infantry should be able to defeat armor without requiring artillery support is now fundamental to military doctrine worldwide. Final statistics. Bazooka production 1942 to 1945. Total M1/M1A1/M9 bazookas produced 476,628. Total rockets produced 15,603,000. Cost per launcher, $18. Cost per rocket, $1.83. Training time for basic proficiency, 2 hours. Pacific Theater performance. Confirmed Japanese tank kills by bazooka, 347. Probable additional kills where weapon couldn't be confirmed, 150 plus. Japanese tanks destroyed by all causes, 2,380. Bazooka kills as percentage, 14.6% minimum. Average range of bazooka kills, 87 yards. Japanese tank losses, Pacific Theater. Total tanks deployed, 2,860. Total tanks lost, 2,380, 83.2%. Tanks destroyed in combat, 1,947. Tanks destroyed by bazookas confirmed, 347. Tanks destroyed by bazookas, estimated total including probables, 520. Tanks abandoned due to mechanical failure or lack of fuel, 433. American bazooka team casualties. Bazooka gunners killed in action, 392. Bazooka loaders killed in action, 287. Total bazooka team casualties killed and wounded, 2,156. Kill ratio, 0.25 Japanese tanks destroyed per American bazooka team casualty. Comparative effectiveness. Pre-bazooka, 1942 to early 1943, Japanese tanks averaged 8.3 days operational before loss. Post-bazooka, mid-1943 to 1945, Japanese tanks averaged 2.7 days operational before loss. Infantry casualties attempting to destroy tanks without bazookas, 4.2 per tank killed. Infantry casualties per tank killed with bazookas, 0.6 per tank killed. The story of the bazooka in the Pacific is ultimately about how technology can shift tactical balance faster than doctrine can adapt. Japanese soldiers scoffed at the bazooka in 1943 because their assessment was based on technical analysis that ignored tactical reality. Yes, the bazooka was inaccurate beyond 100 yards. Yes, it had reliability issues in tropical climates. Yes, it required exposure to enemy fire to employ. But none of those limitations mattered when American doctrine learned to work around them. Accuracy problems at long range trained troops to engage at close range where accuracy was acceptable. Reliability issues improve the design and waterproof the electronics. Exposure to enemy fire develop tactics using terrain, concealment, and rapid displacement after firing. Japanese soldiers watched their tanks, their mobile fortresses, their psychological advantage, their tactical ace transform into burning coffins in seconds. They watched shaped charge jets penetrate armor that was supposed to protect them. They watched crews die in flames inside vehicles that were supposed to keep them safe. Sergeant Yoshio Tanaka had smiled when he saw the Marines shouldering a bazooka at 150 meters on Guam in July 1944. The American weapon looked crude. The rocket flew slowly. His tank had armor. He was safe. 1.3 seconds later, he was dead, killed by physics he didn't understand, technology his military had underestimated, and doctrine his commanders had failed to respect. Captain Jiro Akita had written confidently about Japanese tank superiority on Guadalcanal in 1942. By 1945 on Okinawa, he was writing farewell letters, knowing his tank was his coffin, understanding that American infantry could kill him whenever they chose, accepting death as inevitable. He died as predicted, 5 minutes into battle, hit by a bazooka fired by a 19-year-old Marine who trained on the weapon for 2 hours and was using it in combat for the first time. The bazooka wasn't a sophisticated weapon. It was a tube, a rocket, and shaped charge physics. But it gave American infantry the ability to kill Japanese tanks at ranges where the psychological advantage of armor became psychological terror. It transformed armored warfare from tank-dominated to infantry-dominated. It made Japanese tactical doctrine obsolete faster than Japanese military institutions could adapt. The scoffing stopped at Saipan when 24 tanks burned in one night. It stopped at Guam when 32 tanks were destroyed in 40 minutes. It stopped at Iwo Jima when buried tanks that should have been invulnerable were systematically destroyed. It stopped at Okinawa when the last Japanese armored forces died in flames, killed by infantry with weapons that cost $18 and could be operated by teenagers after 2 hours of training. By 1945, Japanese tankers didn't scoff at bazookas, they feared them, with rational, justified terror. They wrote final letters before operations. They requested transfers to infantry where death might come from bullets instead of fire. They understood that American infantry could kill them whenever convenient, and that armor provided not protection but target identification. Former Lieutenant Suzuki said it at the 1985 symposium. "We scoffed because we didn't understand. We learned to fear because we understood too late." Technology doesn't need to be sophisticated to be decisive, it needs to be effective. The bazooka was crude by artillery standards, but it gave infantry the ability to kill tanks. That was enough. Doctrine matters more than hardware. Japanese tanks were adequate for fighting infantry without anti-tank weapons. They became obsolete when facing infantry with bazookas, not because the tanks changed, but because the infantry changed. Tactical balance can shift faster than institutions can adapt. The Japanese military needed years to accept that their armor advantage had been negated. They didn't have years. By the time they understood, most of their tanks and tankers were already destroyed. The mathematics of the Pacific War's final year. American infantry with $18 weapons were systematically destroying Japanese tanks that cost thousands of dollars and required trained crews that took months to produce. The economic and tactical equation was unsustainable. Japanese soldiers scoffed at American bazookas in 1943. By 1945, the scoffers were dead, burned alive in tanks that burst into flames from weapons they'd dismissed as toys. Their tanks, their mobile fortresses, their tactical advantage, their protection had become steel coffins marked for destruction by any American infantryman with a bazooka and 2 hours of training. The weapon they'd mocked had killed their doctrine, their confidence, and their tanks. The lesson was written in burning steel across every Pacific Island battlefield from Saipan to Okinawa. Never scoff at a weapon that can kill you. Never underestimate an enemy who gives that weapon to every infantry squad. Never assume your advantages are permanent when the other side is innovating. Japanese tankers learned those lessons in fire and death. The survivors carried psychological scars for decades. Men who'd believed armor protected them until shape-charged jets proved otherwise. The American Marines and soldiers who'd carried bazookas into combat knew what they'd achieved. They'd taken a weapon their own military had initially considered marginal and turned it into the decisive infantry anti-tank weapon of the Pacific War. They'd developed tactics that overcame its limitations. They'd trained until they could hit moving targets at 100 yards. They'd gotten close enough to Japanese tanks to kill them despite the personal risk. They'd ended Japanese armored superiority not with better tanks. American tanks rarely fought Japanese tanks in the Pacific, but with better infantry weapons and better doctrine for employing them. The bazooka didn't just destroy Japanese tanks, it destroyed the tactical paradigm where armor dominated infantry. It proved that properly equipped and trained infantry could defeat armor. It showed that shape charge technology could negate armor protection regardless of thickness. Those lessons shaped post-war infantry doctrine worldwide. Every modern army learned from what happened to Japanese tanks in the Pacific. Every modern infantry force carries descendants of the bazooka. Every modern tank design must account for infantry anti-tank weapons because of what the bazooka proved was possible. Japanese soldiers scoffed at the bazooka. Their tanks burst into flames. The scoffing stopped when the fires started and never resumed. The weapon they'd dismissed as crude killed them. The technology they'd underestimated defeated them. The doctrine they'd trusted failed them. And the Marines who'd carried those crude weapons across Pacific Islands proved that sometimes the best weapon isn't the most sophisticated one. It's the one that kills the enemy and comes home in the hands of infantrymen who trusted it with their lives. The bazooka was that weapon. Simple, crude, effective, decisive. Japanese tankers learned to fear it. American infantry learned to trust it. Military history learned from it. The lesson cost Japanese armored forces 2,380 tanks and thousands of crew members. The lesson gave American infantry a weapon that shifted tactical balance decisively in their favor. The lesson proved that infantry could defeat armor with proper weapons and training. Japanese soldiers scoffed at American bazookas until their tanks burst into flames. Then the scoffing stopped. Forever.